Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today at this particular time and this particular moment in history. When Setsu invited me, I was very happy to accept. And the reason is because we've done this before in the immigrants' rights movement. We lived through Trump 1.0. We saw the first regime. We built rapid response networks. We fought executive orders. And so I think in speaking to a lot of my colleagues in the movement, we felt like we're ready, we've got this, we know what to expect, and we're gonna take this head on. So I was really excited about coming and speaking to all of you. As the inauguration came and went, and as the onslaught hit, I started to grow a little bit of a sense of dread. I kept thinking, I'm going to come to this room of young students, and what can I possibly say to you? What can I offer as advice or guidance on how to navigate this moment and the very real threats that we're all up against? I felt like I have to give you some words of optimism, some concrete steps or action plans, and it started to feel really daunting. And something happened as I kind of watched the headlines unfold and more calls of arrests and ICE raids were coming through. We got some video clips through the rapid response networks of people who were using the Know Your Rights cards that we hand out all the time to community members. Standing at the door, I saw video footage of a young woman standing there refusing ICE entering her family's home. We saw people in cars being pulled over, following the script verbatim, the words that we had practiced over and over and told people to say. And I was so moved by this video image because if you've had the experience of going to law school or studying the law, you will know the Supreme Court has something called a reasonable person standard. So they ask, would a reasonable person be able to say no and not give consent to ICE or the police coming into their home? And the reasonable person standard for me has always seemed very unreasonable. You're supposed to be able to stand there with armed police officers and agents in their uniform. You're supposed to be able to stand there and say, no, you can't enter, I do not consent, you can't come in. And for me, who worked at the ACLU and went to law school, it feels intimidating. So watching these young people stand up and defend their family members and their loved ones and their communities was really motivating and inspiring. And it didn't stop there. There were news headlines of doctors who refused to stop giving treatment to trans patients and said, go ahead, arrest me. In my hometown in San Diego, near the border, I have friends, multiple friends in various school districts who work in heavily Latino immigrant communities who were calling and saying, we're getting ICE patrolling every day, they're coming to the school. But their school districts had readiness plans all in place. So they knew exactly what to do. Staff were on site, were trained, and as soon as ICE agents would come to the school, they would say, you have to drive to the district office and speak to the superintendent. We don't have authority to allow you into these premises. And so all around the country, I was seeing everyday, regular people standing up and resisting. And it struck me that in this moment where we have a supposed opposition party in Congress that is completely flailing and unprepared to meet the moment, and the media is sticking to the same old script as though they're just reporting and reciting out talking points and press releases, and where the civil society institutions, the nonprofits that we've always relied on for community defense, are being completely pummeled with funding being stripped from them and constant attacks. It's really been regular people in the community who've been banding together to resist. And so, while I can't offer you blind optimism, I can tell you that being in movement work for about 25 years now, the thing that has always sustained me and kept me from burning out and kept me going and putting one foot in front of the other has really been the resilience and determination that I see in the people. And I think that's important to keep in mind at a moment when our institutions are under such grave attacks and being systematically weakened, targeted, and destroyed, that more than ever, we're going to have to rely on each other to get through this. So having said that, I think it's important to spell out a little bit about exactly who it is that's taken over control of this country, who are they, and what are they after. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think if we're going to talk about the threat we're resisting, it's important to first define it. I think to understand this moment as about being one man is to completely misunderstand what's happening, because they could impeach Trump tomorrow, and this Pandora's box has already been opened. I conceptualize this as an alliance or a political coalition, an unholy trinity, if you will, of three different factions. One, it's populist white nationalists. These are the MAGA cult who have fallen in love with their leader and will blindly follow him wherever he goes. There are the religious fundamentalists who vote for them. They have their own ruling infrastructure and hierarchy, and there's a lot of crossover between the two groups, but they have separate, if not overlapping, motivations. And then there are the tech oligarchs who fund them and who've bought them at a surprisingly paltry price. So I say this because if you think of Trump as this feckless tin pot fascist who's just throwing red meat to the evangelical base, who's kind of giving lip service to white nationalists, it becomes a lot easier to sift through the noise and the chaos and the media headlines and the posturing. We've seen the Gulf of Mexico and these things that are really distractions and symbolic in nature, to really focus on where money and power are being reallocated and moved around. Who is driving these decisions? Because more and more Trump seems disinterested in the actual policy direction and decisions, and it's the people behind him who are enacting executive actions and frankly just completely illegal, off-the-side shadow government acts that are dismantling the state. Those are the people we have to be paying attention to, not the sort of circus show that he's putting on for all of us. Something I often heard coming up on the election from folks on the left and in our movement spaces was, like Trump is the same as Biden. Trump didn't even deport as many people as Obama. Biden is deporting more people than Trump. And so there's been a tendency, I think, to sort of thumb our noses at the threat. And that's why I'm encouraging folks to not focus so much on him, but rather the coalition of forces that are banding around and using him for their own aims. There's some wisdom in this critique that folks are putting forward, because to some extent, if you look at the raw number and the data, they're correct. Trump is not actually deporting more people, and you would not know that if you look at the news. I've listened to podcasts, I've watched YouTube clips of news reporters saying that he's doing this unprecedented action. The numbers of deportations do not support that. He is not deporting more people. However, to cling on to that is to miss the forest for the trees, because he's doing something I believe that is really nefarious and has long-term consequences. On immigration in particular, you can see that from the beginning, even in Trump 1.0, they really went after creating this air of confusion and fear among immigrant communities, to a point where people stayed home, were afraid to send their kids to school, afraid to use hospital services. That in and of itself has a chilling effect that should have all of us concerned. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I think it's also about how they've completely stopped the entire flow of people coming across the border. They've completely shut down refugee admissions and shut down the asylum process in this country. But more than anything, what strikes me is the targeted and systemic attack against civil society. These are, the groups like Lutheran Services or Al Otro Lado, or the groups that are actually out in the community working with immigrants, giving them legal services and representation, they're the ones who are being stripped of funding and attacked. And what that does, more so than deporting a single person, is weaken the entire movement infrastructure that a lot of us who've been working in immigrants' rights for so long have relied on for funding, for those Know Your Rights cards, for pro se help for people who need to go in front of an immigration judge and argue their case. All those organizations that have been arming people with information and support and services are being threatened and at risk of being destroyed. And so I think if we can shift from looking at just pure numbers and thinking a little bit about the infrastructure we've built in recent decades as an immigrants' rights movement and how that is going to fare throughout the duration of this regime, I think we'll be better able to assess exactly what it is we're dealing with. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the things that he's put into effect. One of them is the birthright citizenship executive order, and that seemed to get a lot of fanfare. But when I look at all of his actions, it actually seems the one that he's least serious about and the least interested in. This isn't something that even a typical MAGA voter is really banding to. People want, some wall to be created. They want some legal process. But if you listen to what a typical MAGA voter is saying, nobody is talking about this. And if you read the executive order, it's drafted in a way that it would target people who have green cards and people who are on student visas. And I don't think the tech oligarchs or the business interests would want to see it go through in the way that it's been drafted. So I conceptualize it as something that's like the Heritage Foundation and the Project 2025 folks are really invested in, but I don't see them going after a long-term fight on this. And if they ever do, it'll probably be drastically scaled back from the way it's been currently written. But there are other things that they're doing with gusto, like putting people into Guantanamo. And it seems completely random and arbitrary. And what happens when they're in Guantanamo is that these services that we've talked about, where people fought, they went to court and won the legal right to have lawyers go into detention centers and give people know your rights trainings and workshops and provide them with legal support. If they're in Guantanamo, how is that going to be facilitated? And so again, I think if you look beyond the bluster and at the actual concrete infrastructural changes that he is making, those are, for me, as someone who's been in this field for a while now, the things that really give me pause and frighten me about the future of immigrant justice. So I have to say, some of the reporting that I keep seeing about the Guantanamo Bay issue has really given me pause. And one of the things that I see over and over is these are people who were picked up for low-level, nonviolent offenses. And I think it's worth having this conversation about why we keep saying that. Because the truth is, even if they were, the phrase that constantly folks band about is the rapists and murderers, they still have the right to due process. If they are so dangerous and such a threat to society, then ostensibly you would take them to court, show the evidence, and go through the legal proceedings to have them deported. So what is the purpose of putting them in Guantanamo? And moreover, what is the purpose of the rhetoric and the language those of us who care about human rights have for using this disclaimer over and over that they weren't violent, that they weren't dangerous? And I think one of the things that I've seen in the movement as we go back over the last 2-3 decades is we've had this tendency to divide the immigrant community into binaries of good and bad. Who belongs here? Who's deserving? Who gets protection? Who gets to stay? And nowhere was this more apparent to me than a clip I saw on the news of a guy in Florida whose wife had just been picked up by ICE, and he had voted for Trump. He was like, but she's good. She's one of the good ones. He's supposed to go after criminals. And it's illustrative because I think a lot of folks in the immigrant community have this belief. And we like to say that it's just in the white community, but it's in immigrant communities. I can say for myself, in the Asian communities and the Eastern communities, especially for those of us who come from communities that are susceptible to the model minority myth, we have this tendency to think, not me, it's not going to happen to us. And it gives you a sense of false safety and false comfort. I think if we really want to tackle this head on, we have to start in our own communities and locally in having these conversations and really dialoguing about who is it that deserves to stay? Who is it that we're fighting for? So I want to share a little anecdote with you. When I was working for the ACLU, this was back in the day. I don't know if folks are old enough to remember this, but when Arizona had its Show Me Your Papers law, and basically a bunch of red states in the middle of the country had anti-immigrant legislation they were trying to pass, giving cops the authority to just randomly racially profile people and stop them on the street and ask them to prove they're citizens. And so I was traveling around the middle of the country, going to every red state capital, and trying to help them defeat these bills. And in one particular instance, I went to the state of Kansas, to their state capital, and they were trying to defeat an attempt to end in-state tuition for DACA recipients. They had in-state tuition for everyone in their state colleges there. So all the students there, the activist groups, packed the room. It was full of people. We had a line out the door of young folks who would be impacted by losing in-state tuition, giving testimony in front of the committee. And I helped them prepare their speeches and made sure they had like good messaging and talking points about like wanting to contribute to America and the fabric of this country and all the things that they tell you in the polling to say to sound really like on message. And there was this one young kid, he was skinny, handsome, wore a suit and tie, and he took it like super serious. And when he got up there, the whole room fell into a hush. And all of those legislators, even like the die-hard Republican bigoted ones who were like dying to pass this bill, were like in love with him. They were just watching him like, wow. And afterward, the media crowded around him and wanted to interview him. And thankfully, that bill died. We were able to save in-state tuition, so you can rest easy there. But the reason this stuck out to me is afterward, I started getting calls at my office from the different state representatives who were like, can you help us rewrite this bill? Because we want to kick all the bad ones out, but we want people like him to be able to stay and get tuition. So I was like, okay, what do you mean? Like, what's people like him? What are the eligibility requirements? Like, tell me what you're saying. And they couldn't really, they were like, well, you know, if someone has good grades, I'm like, that's already in the admission criteria. Well, if they like went to high school here, I'm like, you have to have that to get DACA. So we kind of go through the list, and they didn't have a logical thing. They just had this feeling that they really like this kid and they want him to stay. And they have this like imaginary person that they really hate, and they want to make sure that person isn't getting a freebie. And that's always stuck in my head. So when I see people bring this language up, it's not surprising to me. And when I see it in our own communities, among immigrants, among people who are undocumented, it's not surprising to me because I think we've all bought into this myth. We don't have time to get into it today, and I'm already way over time. No, I have a few minutes. So I won't go too much into this, but I will tell you that what the far right has been able to do in this country is not a surprise or an accident. It's something that has been planned and designed for decades. If you go back and research what happened in the 70s and 80s, the way they systematically went into homeschooling, charter schooling, private schooling, the way they systematically took over radio stations and had talking heads. So the disinfo you're seeing on social media, this is the extension and evolution of decades of disinformation and building distrust in government and civil society and civic institutions. And on top of that, they went in and took over the GOP. They went and ran for the local offices from the base and made it so that they drove that party. And the party leadership was afraid of them and had to answer to them. And it didn't happen through one protest, didn't happen through one boycotting campaign. It didn't happen even through like running a really great slate of candidates. It happened through systematic, from the ground up, local work in areas where the Democrats had basically bailed and decided it wasn't worth fighting for those electoral votes. I won't go too much more into it other than to say it's worth researching if you're not familiar with that, because it will give you an appreciation of what we're fighting in the current moment, which isn't just this blip in the screen. It's not just this one egomaniac, but it's really, we're in the swirl of decades and decades of cultural and political organizing work that the far right has done. And so it's easy to feel like you're just being tossed around by the tide in this particular moment. But if we can situate and locate ourselves in the long-range view of history and think about what is it that we're building long-term? Where do we want this country to be in 10 or 20 or 30 years? What is the cultural change that has to happen? What is the narrative and messaging change, the storytelling that we have to do, and frankly, the relationship building we have to do? A lot of our movement spaces, yes, they're doing great with online organizing, but we've become weaker when it comes to relationship building, to community building, to just knowing the folks in your neighborhood. And so when you see a lot of folks online saying, if you want to be part of the resistance, start a community garden, start a book club, it sounds trite, but I actually believe that those are the folks who are really paying attention to what needs to happen long-term in this country. It's about having that conversation with your kooky uncle who keeps saying problematic things and calling them in. And I think we've had a tendency in our movement spaces to be a bit dismissive and write off anyone who's not on point, who's not exactly saying the right thing. But this is a moment where we have an opportunity where they have taken their masks off and lifted the veil. And apolitical, regular people are going to look around and say, this is weird, what's happening? So it's an opportunity for us to really engage them and have conversations and build relationships with one another. And that's the type of work that it will take decades to see the fruit of. It's not something, infrastructure isn't built overnight. And I'm so sad to say that when you see them completely gutting the Department of Education and USAID, those are not things that you can just snap your fingers with a court order and they all come back exactly the same. Infrastructure takes time to build. So I would really urge you all in this moment, and it takes a little bit of a shift. If we're used to being like activists and just going out and raging against the machine, it takes a different muscle. You have to develop a different muscle to be like, what are we building though? We know what we're resisting. I think those of us in this room are pretty clear what we're resisting. But what is it that we're going to build? And I would say to those of you who are in any position of power, whether you're a department chair, whether you're part of a student association, a faculty association, to really think about what power you have in this moment and how you're going to leverage it and who you're going to use it to protect, the same way that those doctors and school administrators are working to protect their communities. What all are you going to be doing with the power you have in this moment? Those of us who are in this room have some privileges that folks in the country may not all have. So how are you going to be using it in this moment? So I do have some practical advice. If that's of interest, maybe we can get into it in the Q&A. I'm happy to list off some organizations to support and follow. But I think my overall message I really wanted to leave you all with was to be thinking long term, to not be getting distracted by the clown show and the circus act. And if you plant those seeds, surely after this very long winter, they will begin to spring. Thank you.